Throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, few game studios were as prolific as Konami. From all of their long-running staple series such as Castlevania, Metal Gear, and Contra, to the immensely successful new IPs they'd establish, from the horror giant that Silent Hill would become, the hit visual novel series Tokimeki Memorial, to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game. They also had a major chokehold over arcades in Japan, with their rhythm game giants Dance Dance Revolution and Beatmania. Their internal studios, such as the massive Konami Computer Entertainment Japan, were some of the industry's biggest headliners, and one of the men who helped shape the direction of the company during this period was none other than Hideo Kojima. Beyond his success as a director, Kojima had quickly climbed up the corporate ladder at the studio, and had built trust with many of the company's higher-ups as well as his own development team. But talking about this game industry auteur has been covered from every angle. The influence of the man's career has been well documented. He's one of the most celebrated figures in the entire game industry. But Kojima wasn't just a game director, he was also a producer, and it's one of the more underappreciated series that he produced that I'm here to talk about today. The fast-paced mecha action game series and its excellent anime spin-offs, Zone of the Enders. After the development and success of 1998's Metal Gear Solid, and before moving on to the full development of 2001's Metal Gear Solid 2, Kojima developed the desire to craft another mecha series of the more action-centric variety. That creative spark would lead to the creation of Zone of the Enders, though this new series would be a unique case for the esteemed director. Despite being the initial individual to come up with the idea for the series, he wasn't the one to give it its own identity. He played the roles of a somewhat hands-off series producer, opening the door for many other members of his closest development team to craft the series, and give it its own unique voice. The events of Zone of the Enders are set between 2167 and 2174, taking place in a future where humans have developed colonies throughout space, primarily on Mars. Space travel and science in general have taken a massive leap forward, thanks to the extraterrestrial metal known as Metatron, mined from the Callisto moon of Jupiter. The metal now being the human race's ultimate power source. The greatest achievement used creating Metatron, though, are the Mars-created orbital frames. Immensely powerful robots fueled by refined Metatron ore. These orbital frames and the pilots who controlled them, referred to as runners, would become essential to establishing a new era for both Earth and Mars. Any humans that live away from the Earth on one of the colonies are known as Enders, with the series title referring to the land that these Enders reside in, the Zone of the Enders. The central plot that cuts through every entry of the series focuses on the growing tension between Earth and Mars, as the people of Mars are seeking full independence. This makes way for a militant revolutionary group known as Baram to come into existence, with the goal of liberating Mars from Earth's control. It's through the actions of Baram that the UNSF of Earth is spurred to put more pressure onto Mars, enforcing their dominance over the colonies. The series' main theme is asking what freedom really entails, the relationship between colonies and the superpower that controls them, and the prejudice and conflict that spawns from this. While the only entries in the series that really get down and dirty with exploring these ideas are the anime and the Gameboy Advanced game, the two central Konami-developed entries for the PlayStation 2 have their own ways of weaving these themes into their narratives, between all the non-stop action. The first game in the series and the initial pitch for it was created by what was basically a multimedia supergroup. Hideo Kojima as producer, Tokimeki Memorial CD drama writer and Policenauts lead programmer, Noriaki Okamura as writer and director, lead Metal Gear artist Yoshi Shinkawa as mechanical designer, and famed animator and character designer Nobuyoshi Nishimura to serve the role of character design. While the staff of the first game had even more relevant names on it, I'll cover those when I get to specifically discussing that title. Just know that these four served as a foundation that the spirit of the first game would be built upon. In fact, Noriaki Okamura said it best when he stated that the goal of Zone of the Enders was not to be a normal mecha game, but a mecha animation simulator. From the get-go, the team behind the title wanted to create a game that made you as the player feel like the pilot of a fast-moving, easy-to-control machine of immense power. With the initial rough gameplay demos being developed for the PC and the Dreamcast in 1999, it was decided that the game's development would be put on pause, due to Sony's upcoming PlayStation 2, with the team feeling that this new upcoming console would be the perfect home for the action-packed title. And to further drum up excitement for the upcoming title, Konami would commission the legendary mecha animation giant Sunrise to produce an OVA prequel set 5 years before the events of the first game, as well as signing off on a deal for Sunrise to produce their own 26-episode original series set in the new IP's universe. The OVA would be included as a pack-in with the Japanese exclusive limited edition of the first game. With it being a new IP and requiring a stronger push in the global market, Kojima and Konami business higher-ups decided that the title should come with a demo of the hotly anticipated Metal Gear Solid 2, a move that would certainly help Zone of the Enders immediately become an established name. With Kojima still busy working on the long-awaited Metal Gear Solid sequel, Okamura and his core development team would end up shipping the first PS2 release of Zone of the Enders in Japan, along with the Sunrise-produced OVA prequel, on March 1st, 2001, with the North American and European releases of the game following at the end of that month. Zone of the Enders unfortunately only ran for 2 years, receiving 2 mainline PS2 titles from Konami, 2 anime produced by Sunrise, and 1 Game Boy Advanced game developed by former Super Robot Wars dev Winkysoft. Aside from a handful of re-releases and a cancelled set of plans for a third game, Zone of the Enders was only active during this short 2-year period, from 2001 to 2003, and with 3 entirely separate companies having had their hands in the series, it's impressive that in such a short window of time, such a packed and varied universe was built that still manages to come together with surprising cohesion, despite the lack of direct contact between the 3 teams that worked on it. In this brief but fantastic little franchise, we got one of the most smooth and responsive action titles to ever release and 2 fantastic anime. Projects like Zone of the Enders don't happen anymore at a pace this quickly, and it's a series I really do love and think more of Kojima's fans should be aware of outside of just the second game. It's a tight, densely packed franchise that shouldn't be living in the shadow of its stealth action older brother. So this is my complete look back on the wild ride that Zone of the Enders was. With this retrospective, I'm covering all 5 main entries. You would likely expect me to talk about that original game first, but in this case I'm going to start off with talking about the OVA prequel that Sunrise produced as a packet, as it's chronologically the first entry in the series, and it happened to release the same day as that original game. This fantastic 50-minute short film is Zone of the Enders 2167, Idolo. Zone of the Enders 2167, Idolo, centers around the testing phase of the first orbital frame, the titular Idolo, and its runner, Radom Levins. The testing phase and production of the first orbital frame is led by Barham scientist Dr. Rachel Lynx, a brilliant scientist who has the utmost faith in Radom's ability to control the prototype mech. But as Radom spends more time inside of the cockpit of Idolo, his mental state begins to deteriorate daily, as his conscience shows signs of slipping, potentially due to unsafe overexposure to Metatron that comes as a result of piloting the frame. Idolo is a 1-episode, 50-minute OVA that serves as a great introduction to the series. Not only does it establish the beginning of the orbital frames as a concept, but it also sets up the primary narrative threads that would run throughout the rest of the series. The conflict between the Earthlings and the Enders, specifically the Martian Enders, is illustrated in just enough detail to create a sense of intrigue about the setting, and puts you right over Radom's shoulder, a man who deeply loves the red planet he grew up on, and believes strongly that Earth should separate itself from Martian affairs. The OVA also sets up the primary antagonist of the first game, Viola. As it shows her past with Radom, her animosity towards his girlfriend and Barham scientist, Dolores Hayes, and how the events of the OVA radicalized her into the character she would be in the first game. I don't want to go into more detail about the OVA's story, as it is a very short, single-episode affair that serves the purpose of setting up both the game it came packed in with, and the 26-episode anime that would begin airing later that month. From a production standpoint, Idolo is much more of a Sunrise creation than it is a Konami one. While Okamura and Kojima may have drafted the basic setup for the plot of the series, and created the character Viola, it was writer Shin Yoshida, longtime scribe for all of the Yu-Gi-Oh anime, who would pen the script for the OVA. And the script he provided, while fairly plain, does more than enough within its 50-minute runtime. All 4 central characters get well established. Radom's determination to see Martian independence and his love for Dolores are both believable, and seeing those 2 emotional pillars become corrupted over the course of the OVA's runtime is certainly disheartening, if brief. Viola's building stress and disillusionment with everything surrounding her also does a fine job of setting up her role as the first game's antagonist. Dolores is the character we get the least major screen time with, but what's there establishes her as a sort of portrait of innocence, who seeks to live a simple life with her boyfriend and see Mars freed from its oppression. Dr. Lynx is shown as a bit gung-ho about her ideas for the future, but her heart is in the right place, even if her no-breaks attitude and her hand in creating the orbital frames as they would come to be known has both separated her from her estranged family and set the events of this story into motion, as well as being the catalyst for Barham's explosive uptick in the development of orbital frames, using her work as the basis. Doing enough with a little is really the best way to describe Idolo's narrative. It's not particularly strong on its own, but as a first stop on the timeline and as a prologue to the first game, it does its job pretty well. The strongest aspect of this OVA though is certainly its visuals. Idolo was the final anime produced by Sunrise to be primarily done with cell animation, with some very nice CG compositing for certain background shots. This was 2001, and all of Sunrise departments were shifting gears into digital animation. This gives Idolo the unique title of being one last hurrah for the rich, vibrant colors and depth of cell animated movies. It makes the OVA feel quite a bit older than it actually is, which goes a long way in achieving Kojima and Okamura's original goal of trying to create a game series that felt like a classic mecha anime. Kumi Hori serves as the OVA's character designer, giving the OVA a look that stands out as very unique from Nishimura's character design sheets for the first game. Hori took the approach of making characters truly look mature in his designs. All of the characters look like fully grown adults, which does a good job grounding the believable war-torn setting. The strongest element of the design work in the OVA is none other than the titular mecha, Idolo. While its original design was drafted by the great Yoji Shinkawa, its final anime look was sharpened and refined by Tsutomu Miyazawa and Tsutomu Suzuki. The Tsutomu duo, in Shinkawa's own words, impressed him in how they translated his design into 2D animation. And what a strong design it is. Idolo is a very humanoid mech, with much of its structure appearing like an armored skeleton. Its spine clearly on full display, its front covered in sharp quadrants of paper white metal, and its hands equipped with sharp, slightly effeminate nails. And of course, there's its unmistakable and very literal cockpit. Idolo's design stands out from pretty much every other mecha design in the early 2000s, due to Shinkawa's mastery of aggressive, chunky shapes. Idolo's blinding white color palette, complemented by the green lines of Metatron energy running through it, and its aforementioned skeletal-like appearance, helps give it a somewhat ethereal look. Idolo is a name that quite literally means an image of a god, an idol, and its all-powerful presence fits that name perfectly. It appears elegant and royal compared to the other military mechs, or LEV units, used by both Barum and the UNSF. This very godly appearance would be the running theme Shinkawa would go with for the designs in the series, as each of the primary mecha going forward would be named after and visually inspired by deities of Egyptian mythology. I'll go into more detail about this when discussing the main games and the full 26-episode show. The OVA's rich atmosphere is honed by its director, Tetsuya Watanabe, who had his hand in many Sunrise mecha classics, as well as being one of the core cinematographers for the end of Evangelion. His directing helps the OVA's down-to-earth tone maintain consistent throughout its runtime, and his effectiveness as a director is particularly shown off in the OVA's unforgettable final battle, which alone makes the OVA a worthwhile watch in my opinion. Radom Levin's downfall is a solid prologue to the first game, that's only amplified by the freedom Sunrise was given by Konami to do what they wanted in this OVA. Takehito Koyasu's performance as Radom lends plenty of believability to his slowly unraveling mental state. It's a seriously solid performance from a legendary voice actor. Again, Idolo is only a 50-minute OVA. You could go and watch it right now for that matter. It was licensed by ADV back in the early 2000s, so unfortunately it's never seen a re-release in the West of any sort. It received the proper Blu-ray remaster in 2012 to go along with the Zone of the Enders HD collection. That Blu-ray, of course, was also Japanese exclusive. But much like most of the other media covered on this channel, you know the other ways to watch it. And with the OVA's final scene set mere moments before the events of the first game, there's no reason not to check this one out. In 2172, on the Jupiter-based space colony Antilla, tensions are rising between a currently occupying UNSF and the Enders born and raised on the colony. In a moment of chaos, Barum suddenly launches an attack on the colony, with the cover-up goal of pushing back the UNSF, though their real goal is far more sinister. They seek to acquire a new orbital frame, perhaps the most powerful yet, Jehuti. A 13-year-old boy named Leo Stenbeck finds himself in the midst of this chaos, finding himself in the position of Jehuti's accidental pilot, leading to a series of events that would change the course of Mars, Jupiter, and Earth forever. Zone of the Enders 1 picks up right where the epilogue of Idolo leaves off, with Viola leading the attack on the Antilla colony. The start of the game is complete chaos, quickly introducing the player to the lead character Leo, and the series poster child mech, Jehuti, and the very advanced AI program installed within it, Ada. The story of the game mainly focuses on Leo and Ada's growing relationship, and how the two end up influencing each other for the better, all while fighting off Barum in an attempt to push them off Antilla, and assisting the UNSF civilian transport ship Atlantis in evacuating survivors of Barum's attack. Zone of the Enders 1 has a very simple story that's strongest elements come from its core themes. While the actual events of the game, and even much of the dialogue not involving Ada, Leo, or Viola is fairly paper thin, it's that core dynamic between Leo and Ada that carries the game. This is a story all about growing up and leaving behind childhood to become an adult. Leo at the start of the game is hated by his own father, his friends, and pretty much every person he interacts with on Antilla, aside from his closest friend, Sylvise. Because of the constant harassment and isolation Leo experienced through his brief but traumatic life, he's quick to try and run from his problems, and shift the blame onto himself for any terrible events that transpire around him. Ada is the hard opposite of Leo. She's an artificial intelligence designed specifically to oversee Jehuti's functions, and have it run at peak performance. She is, for all intents and purposes, a weapon, who sticks hard and fast to her pre-programmed goal of getting Jehudi off Antilla safely. This creates a clear tension between the two leading characters. A boy used to running from his problems, and a machine dead set on her one unchanging goal. But over the course of the game, the two of them learn from each other, with Leo finally finding a sense of purpose and another friend in Ada, and Ada learning that she has more value than just being a computer program, especially to Leo. Viola is also a strong contrast to the heroic duo. She's a bit closer to how Ada starts off, being dead set in her belief that all of her actions, as vile as some of them are worth it at the end of the day to bring independence and freedom to Mars, and the rest of the Zone of the Enders. But she also has a vicious inferiority complex, with Leo's skill piloting Jehudi in particular driving her into a white-hot rage, forcing her to ask herself how a literal child can show so much strength. The story of Zone of the Enders is thematically strong in how it uses its central three characters. It really is a story about personal growth during times of conflict. But it's slightly held back by fairly standard, repetitive scenarios aside from a few small segments right at the end of the game, as well as its incredibly short length. Zone of the Enders is short, really short. The game will take you anywhere from 2.5 to 4 hours, and that's with watching every cutscene. Right as Leo and Ada hit their high points, the game ends, with an admittedly awesome setup for the true antagonist of the series going forward, but the game really does feel like it ends right as it's getting to its highest high. Okamura did a decent job writing the game's story, that's for sure, but this first outing is far from the strongest entry of the series in terms of story. But it really wasn't the game's story that led it to becoming a success. That came from its core gameplay loop. Zone of the Enders was designed to be a playable mecha anime after all, and the game's dev team did a knockout job on this first outing. In most action games, you either have ground combat with air combos, or primarily air combos. Zone of the Enders stands out thanks to Jehudi's control scheme. Jehudi's movement covers the entire plane of the game's visible combat zones. You can move up into the air, down to the ground, and all around the enemies on screen. There is no limit to where Jehudi can move. You have full and precise control of where it's located at any given time. Jehudi is also equipped with a boost ability, allowing it to do either a single press micro dash forward, or a held full dash. Attacking has 3 modes, normal, dash, and charge. Normal attacks just being usable while Jehudi is set to its default movement, and dash attacks active while Jehudi is in a micro dash or full dash. Charge attacks are what you get when you use the dash button while having Jehudi standing completely still and hitting the attack button. These attacks are slow but do massive damage. Attacking while far from an enemy makes Jehudi use its ranged beam attacks, while being up close and personal lets Jehudi use its blade arm to bash up any bots it comes in contact with. The game is at its best when you really get into the flow of a fight. Microdashing rapidly between enemies and switching targets you're locked onto creates incredibly fast-paced but very digestible fights. Zone of the Enders camera is frankly fantastic for a game of its speed. The automated lock-on will always keep the camera centered on your target, following Jehudi with speed and precision. When you get knee-deep into the combat, you really feel as if you're directing an action scene in a fast-paced mecha anime. Dash attacking to push an enemy back into one of the game's destructible environments, while quickly chasing them with a series of microdashes to keep the damage going, is immensely satisfying. Okamura and his team managed to nail the feeling they set out to achieve with Jehudi's speed and ease of control. Unfortunately, there are some shortcomings in the gameplay. The sub-weapons that you unlock throughout the game end up being mainly menu clutter, as only about 3 of them have any legitimate useful applications in combat. 2 in particular come to mind as their application is only ever used for one boss fight, and one segment involving a locked gate. This is unfortunate since collecting some of these weapons requires going out of your way to do bonus missions in the game, that end up really not being worth it. The real reward for combat and taking on side missions is leveling up Jehudi, which boosts its health. This health boost mainly comes in handy during some of the game's very chaotic boss fights. The bosses, aside from multiple rival fights against Viola, are one-off Barum members rocking their own lebs and frames. They come in, talk a big game to Leo, and then just dip or die the moment the fight is over. They don't leave an impression at all, as many of the fights are fairly plain. The ones that do stand out are the bosses that actually have some real mobility and don't just stand there shooting you. The actual design of the game is also fairly repetitive. You go back and forth between cities, towns, and factory regions on Antilla. Clearing the main story regions unlocks more of Antilla and so forth. Though the game, despite its short length, somehow pads itself out by having you backtrack to certain areas to get a one-use weapon or program code needed to advance the story. When not backtracking, certain side missions will appear in previously visited regions, that most often entail clearing an area of enemies without damaging any buildings in the area to avoid collateral, and saving all of the civilians in these given zones. You can totally go ahead and let the whole area get demolished during these side activities, but it will affect how you're ranked on them. These being the only moments in the game that are ranked to begin with, which at least gives them a unique if odd place in the game's structure. The first 2 hours of the game are a consistent repeat of this formula, with 1 or 2 slightly neat set pieces. But it really is the core combat and just how satisfying Jehudi is to control that carries the game, because the other aspects of the game's design really show that nearly all the thought was put into how Jehudi itself controls, and not so much mission structure. Despite these issues, there's still really no game that plays quite like Zone of the Enders. The closest I can think of is Omega Boost, and even that title is vastly different in its gameplay. Konami Computer Entertainment Japan made something really special with Jehudi as a playable mech. It's the main reason to play the game, and it still controls great to this day. The game's visuals are also very strong, when not in a cutscene, and I'll get to that in a second. Jehudi's model is excellent, with an easy to distinguish orange spine and gray accents cutting through its turquoise color scheme, and a clear green radar ring surrounding it at all times, always providing a good sense of reorientation after an overwhelming fight. Design-wise, it's a very similar mecha to Shinkawa's Idolo design, but with a few major differences. Jehudi takes on an appearance closer to a heavily armored, more bird-like version of Idolo, appearing far less skeletal, giving off a more refined, complete design. This alongside with it having actual wings on its back, instead of the little nubs Idolo was stuck with. These bird-like elements come from the Egyptian god it's named after. Thoth, or his Egyptian name, Jehudi, the god of wisdom and the moon, serves as the main visual inspiration for the mech, beyond just sharing its name. Thoth taking on the appearance of a human with the head of an iblis bird, with a similar orange and turquoise color palette. Looking at Jehudi and Thoth side by side, and taking into consideration Shinkawa's own rule of cool, very easily readable approach to its design, you can directly get a neat look into his thought process when it came to Jehudi's silhouette and flourishes. Frankly, Jehudi is one of my favorite mecha designs ever. It's a gorgeous looking machine packed with personality and elegance. In Shinkawa's own words, not only do the designs look cool as they are, but they are creations based on my thinking regarding how they're controlled by the player, how they should react, and what kinds of actions they should exhibit in the game. Shinkawa's mindset here is reflected perfectly in the final product, bolstered by Jehudi's animations, both in its movement and its attacks. It's got such a slick, cool-looking design that stands out as one of the most memorable mechanical designs of the early 2000s period. Jehudi is of course not the only standout design of the game. The regular mooks you fight throughout, from the flying thumbtacks that are the raptors, to the heavily armored mummy head variants, also give the game's enemy design a unique visual presence that you won't really get in any other game series. Many of the game's bosses are reminiscent of Egyptian iconography as well, from large sarcophagus-shaped units to towering mechanical structures almost reminiscent of the pyramids themselves. Shinkawa's entire approach to the mecha's look stuck close to the Egyptian inspiration. Viola's Neith also follows this design pattern. Named after the goddess, the mech takes a distinctly feminine appearance, calling back to its namesake, with the signature deep red colors Neith is associated with in mythology, and a very crown-like head shape that gives off an image of royalty and power not to be trifled with. It also matches Viola's determination perfectly. Another strength of the game's visuals is Antilla itself. The entire colony is soaked in the darkness of space, only lit up by its artificial sky and the lights of the cities and factories all throughout the colony. It gives the entire place a dreary, almost depressing mood, one that fits the ongoing war on its surface perfectly. While there are only about 3 types of areas in the game, every city, every town, and every factory, while they share the same textures, are all very unique in their layout, that it helps sell Antilla as a real place. And this makes the location pretty believable. The overworld map that you fly up to go between areas is really where the scale of Antilla is brilliantly displayed. The dark empty void of space, only decorated by the city lights below, and the bright looming giant of Jupiter above, makes for beautiful but cold imagery, serving as a moment of calm in between all of the game's chaotic battles. Zone of the Enders has a pretty fantastic soundtrack that was handled by the Konami power team of Maki Kirioka, Akihiro Honda, Norihiko Hibino, Toshiyuki Kakuta, and Shuichi Kobori. Every battle track bumps with its own pulse-pounding beats that match the speed of the gameplay, and ooh, that overworld music is nice. The strongest tracks in the game though are the opening and ending theme Kiss Me Sunlights and Flowing Destiny. Both songs are gorgeous, drenched in the hypnotic vocals Heart of Air was known for. Kiss Me Sunlights is also the perfect song for the series in general. Both lyrically and in terms of composition, it truly represents what Zone of the Enders feels like. The voice acting in the game is hard region locked, meaning that over in the West you are stuck with the English dub, which isn't terrible, but it's also far from great. Remy LeBoeuf handled the voice of Leo in the game, and I've gotta say, he sounds rough, but he was also prepubescent when he got cast for the role in the first place. And honestly, this goes quite some ways in making Leo feel more believable. I always appreciate when a child actor actually plays a child, even if his performance isn't always great. LeBoeuf is actually a pretty solid Brooklyn-based saxophonist nowadays, who's even landed himself a few Grammy nods. So it's pretty funny to go all the way back here and see some of his earliest work in the arts. Cynthia Marcucci easily puts on the best performance of the game as Ada, which is somewhat ironic as Ada herself speaks in a cold, very robotic manner. But Marcucci's performance still manages to carry the character in an engaging way. Rest of the vocal performances in the game aren't too memorable, and aside from a few very funny line reads, nothing really stands out next to the 2 leads. Another issue that plagues the game is the disconnect between its CG cutscenes and all of its in-game events. When you're in-game, the title looks pretty fantastic, having held up very well thanks to strong lighting and good texture work, as well as robot models with their generally more rigid shape, aging far better in games with lower polygon counts than any human character models could at the time. The problems arise when the CG pre-rendered cutscenes start. You see, Okamura, while directing the game and penning the game's story, couldn't really figure out a way to naturally integrate larger chunks of dialogue into the game without entirely killing the flow in between combat. This is where his Tokimeki Memorial puzzle writing assistant, Shuyo Murata, would be brought in to direct the CG cutscenes, while reworking the more dialogue-heavy sequences into these scenes in a way that didn't cut into the actual playable segments. And while his effort was certainly not in vain, these cutscenes frankly look terrible. While the actual choice of camera angles and the lighting is very strong, these human character models are freakish, and look like they come right out of one of those third-rate animated DVDs you buy from the gas station. Lip sync for the dialogue is also non-existent, as these movies were only rendered out once. And on top of that, they don't particularly match the Japanese audio either. It's unfortunate how distracting the human character models are in these scenes, because they really undersell how strong Noriaki Okamura's character designs are. Seeing all of his original character illustrations really puts them in sharp contrast to these cutscenes. This is really no fault of Murata and his CG team though. This was his first time directing anything, and he did a pretty decent job all things considered. On top of this, I give Murata some leeway, as he would later move on to arguably become the single most influential voice for what the series of Zone of the Enders would be remembered and cherished for. But we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Aside from the issues I've already brought up, Zone of the Enders is a good little title. It may be light on content and fairly shallow outside of its combat, but for a quick afternoon romp, it's more than worth a playthrough. You can see the success Okamura and his dev team achieved in their goal of making a game that's just tight to play. Kojima was also pretty proud of the title as a producer, being extremely happy with how the title turned out after it sold 800,000 copies, which is very good for a new untested IP. This would quickly lead Kojima to greenlight a sequel, and much of the staff from Zone of the Enders 1 would shift gears to begin drafting that second project. I see many people state that this first game should be skipped, due to its more lackluster elements, but this really isn't something I agree with. The game isn't the greatest of all time, but it's certainly worth at least one single-sitting playthrough. If you want to have the most optimal experience playing the game, I suggest you play it on the original PS2, if you have access to it. In 2012, the game would receive a remaster along with the second game in the Zone of the Enders HD collection, released on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Unfortunately, this remaster was a mess. From broken textures, to transparency errors, to an abysmal, inconsistent frame rate, this remaster just didn't do the original game justice. Only the PS3 version would receive a patch of any sort as well. And even after that, the patch was primarily focused on addressing the issues in the second game, pushing one to the side. If you own an Xbox Series S or X though, you can play the 360 version through backwards compatibility and it'll run at 60 FPS, through the brute force of those system specs. So aside from the aforementioned visual flaws, it's not the worst idea to play the games on one of the Xbox Series consoles if you don't have access to the PS2. But if you do have a PS2, go and play it on that. Zone of the Enders 1 is a flawed but very decent foundation for the series to be built on. Only a month after the release of Zone of the Enders 1 and Idolo in Japan, on April 7th, 2001, Sunrise would begin airing its full 26-episode follow-up to its initial OVA, with Tetsuya Watanabe sticking around as director, Shin Yoshida as writer, and Kumi Hori as character designer. Along with over 70% of the OVA's production crew, Zone of the Enders Dolores I would begin its television run. Set 5 years after the events of Idolo, Dolores follows the husband of Dr. Lynx from the OVA, James Lynx, who's currently working as a down-on-his-luck space trucker, believing for the last 5 years that his wife had died during the events of Idolo. Everything changes when he takes on a job to transport a mysterious package to Earth. That package turns out to contain an orbital frame sent by Rachel, Dolores. With James stumbling his way into piloting Dolores, he sets out to reunite with his children, Noelle and Leon Lynx, as they set out on a wild adventure from Earth to Mars to find out where Rachel may be hiding, all while being pursued by both Barham and the UNSF. Zone of the Enders Dolores I is a road trip comedy mecha series that focuses primarily on the theme of family. That makes it the most tonally distinct entry in the entire franchise. And to be entirely honest, this is my second favorite thing to come from Zone of the Enders as a series. Dolores is an excellent comedy with plenty of heartfelt emotional beats that keep you very attached to the characters and their wild adventure. It also does plenty to tie directly into the events of the first game, with episodes 1 through 12 taking place days prior to the events of Zone of the Enders 1, and the back half of the series set right after the events on Antilla had transpired. Though actual characters from the games are used sparingly, and only when it feels necessary, the focus of the show through and through really is the Lynx family and Dolores. James Lynx has to be one of my favorite mecha protagonists. A man in his late 40s trying his best to reunite with his estranged family, even if he's long out of practice in the whole being a dad thing. This helps to make James one of the most unique protagonists I've seen in a mecha anime. He's over the age of 45, which really is not a common thing you can say about most mecha protagonists, who are often in their teens or their 20s. And even when it comes to anime dads, he's unique. The man is a complete mess, whose life has almost entirely collapsed. The only thing he's got going for him is that he's still in good shape, and hasn't fallen into a dad bod trap yet. James is incredibly charming. He'll go the extra mile to see his loved one succeed and be happy, even if he has to make himself look like a fool or have the military chasing him for a crime he didn't commit. He's a man on a mission. As the opening text says, a robust father. He is the true, real family guy. Seeing him read books on how to be a proper father, and having him fumble his attempts at relating to his kids, it's honestly quite endearing and quickly gets you on his side. He's also just a swell dude, a bit hot-headed and quick-tempered, but he's a great guy who stays true to his family-centric philosophy. His relationship with both of his kids and Dolores is the emotional core of the show. The misunderstanding he has with what his children, now both in their 20s, actually want out of him makes you pity him but also respect him for actually trying to be a good father and make up for the last 5 years since Rachel's quote-unquote death. His interaction with every side character, from one-offs to the consistent thorn in his side that is the UNSF agent, Van Dorform, are great. Van Dorform insists on calling James John Carter, after the Edgar Rice Burroughs character. This show loves its Western media franchises. Dorform is the direct opposite of James, and it makes for some serious gold. James Links is the dad that everyone wishes they had. The literal greatest of all time there's been for anime fathers. The man is unstoppable. This dude is a dad-ass dad, and I love him. Tesho Genda plays the role of a slightly goofy and overcompensating, but still stand-up man perfectly, really hamming it up with how gruff and exaggerated he makes the voice. James Link's two kids, Noelle and Leon, are also pretty great. Noelle is pretty much her father's mini-me, but quite a bit more intelligent. She ends up being the family's peacemaker throughout most of the shenanigans that go on. Ai set on the goal of reuniting with her mother and making sure her father and brother don't kill each other. She's a real, regular working-class woman. Being the head of her team at a construction company, she knows how to manage a wild situation, while also providing a surprisingly relaxed presence amidst the chaos. Like repairing machinery or just chilling with the family cat, Pete, an icon in of himself. Leon is the hard opposite from his father and sister. He's found himself a nice cushy job way up on the corporate ladder, even straight up cucking his company's CEO. He's doing quite well for himself. That is until his dad is pressed with criminal charges by the UNSF, forcing him and Noelle to join their father on his wild adventure. Leon starts off as quite snobbish and resistant to doing anything aside from finding his mom and getting the hell out of there. But as the series goes on, he begins to loosen up slowly but surely, becoming more like James and really accepting his wild side. There's also some uncomfortable implications about Leon's feelings towards his mother, which the show swiftly and thankfully drops. Narumi Hidaka and Mitsuru Miyamoto voice Noelle and Leon respectively, and they both do a great job giving these two distinct personalities from James. The titular Dolores, though, is the second strongest character in the series behind James. Where Ada was an AI that managed the performance of Jehuti, Dolores is both the AI and the orbital frame. This is a mech with a conscience and a personality of its own, and that personality is that of a ditzy teenage girl, essentially becoming James's adopted niece, insisting on calling him uncle at all times. She is a joy to watch, constantly overestimating her own abilities and causing massive collateral damage, while still trying her darndest to impress her newfound family. She is a literal elephant in the room for the Lynx family to deal with, as well as being the source of their recent galactic infamy. She is adorable, always daydreaming and thinking up new ideas to impress her dear uncle, and be the best niece she can be. That is until she enters her enraged combat state, where she becomes a proper destructive orbital frame. The heart of the series is Dolores herself. Watching this big machine mature from what's basically a child to an adult feels surprisingly natural, and her relationship with James is so genuine that you've got to be a bit heartless to not get invested in her journey. Huko Kuwashima plays her perfectly, convincingly putting on the cadence of a teenage girl trying to find herself. The trials and tribulations of the Lynx family are really what makes this show so good. Episodes range from heartwarming to hilarious on a whim, in a way that only this weird family road trip comedy can provide. One moment the impact war has on small local communities can be discussed, while the next James might meet one of his literary idols in a don't meet your heroes type scenario. I'm not going to go into much detail on the show's second half, as it's really worth experiencing, especially with all of its twists and turns and direct ties to the first game, as well as introducing some very interesting original characters. But its payoff for every plot thread set up in the first 12 episodes, as well as its payoff for the Idolo OVA, certainly makes the show's planning feel airtight. Shin Yoshida managed to craft a script that ties perfectly into the universe of Konami's games, while also writing an excellent sequel to his own OVA. The show also loves to reference movies, especially American action and sci-fi films, with every single episode title being named after a famous film. For example, the episode Die Hard sees James making a direct reference to the movie. These references are cheeky enough that the series never comes across as overly reliant on them. It's simply wearing its more Western-influenced style of storytelling on its sleeve. If anything, it helps Yoshida's script feel like that wild family road trip movie it is, as opposed to falling into the more traditional trappings of typical anime scripting. This is seriously one of the few anime that I can think of that speaks more to a Western audience. It gives the show a really unique identity that stands out from the rest of the series and most mecha anime in general. The show also loves being blatantly cheesy about its positive family message, leaning into it hard in ways that's fun rather than groan-worthy. It's really cool to see a more everyday side of the Zone of the Enders universe as well, between cities on Earth and counties on Mars. You get a much better feeling for the universe of Zone of the Enders in this show than the main two games ever provided. Following the Link's family through the galaxy provides Zone of the Enders universe with a much needed sense of tangibility. What helps this is the show's solid art direction. Tsutomu Miyazawa and Tsutomu Suzuki returned to handle the mechanical design in the show. And while many of the designs are still primarily based off of Shinkawa's game designs, Dolores herself is the outcome of Miyazawa and Suzuki's combined effort. And boy do I love this design. Her color palette being primary shades of pink plays into her girly persona, but there's other subtle touches that help emphasize this part of her, and make her stand out from the other orbital frames. For one, her ears are far more slim than Jehudi's. They also actively move around and emote like a cat's ears, allowing for more expressions to be communicated without Dolores actually having a face. Her chest region is also adorned in armor that appears in the shape of a small pink blazer, slightly calling back to spunky character designs such as Allenby from G Gundam. She's also softer all around, consisting of less sharp angles than the other orbital frames in the series. This helps communicate her personality perfectly prior to even watching the show. Miyazawa and Suzuki did some fantastic work in creating an exceptionally distinct orbital frame. Kumihori returned as character designer for Dolores, and brings the same level of subtle realism that was present in Idolo, with any returning characters from that OVA having the same designs they did there. This realistic approach in this series amplifies the comedy and over-the-top slapstick at times too, creating a fun juxtaposition. Sadly, unlike the OVA, Dolores was done entirely in digital animation, and while all of the design work is still very strong, it falls into the same issues many of Sunrise early digital shows did, where coloring and line work can bleed into each other, leading to occasional muddy images. Thankfully, that doesn't happen often in Dolores, and due to the focused character design, most of the animation gets away with being fairly limited. When a battle starts in the show though, all stops are pulled out, because when Dolores fights, there's just as much finesse and speed as what was present in the battles of Idolo. Dolores knows when to use its resources well, to keep the production looking consistent throughout. Much of the music in Dolores is recycled from Zone of the Enders 1, which fits fine, but when a more emotional or comedic scene occurs, original tracks composed by Heart of Air's Masumi Ito are used to great effect. She composed a lovely soundtrack that fits the mood of every scene. On top of a good original soundtrack, Dolores' opening theme, Zone of the Enders, is performed by none other than Hironobu Kageyama's band Lazy. And to use one word to describe the opening, it's rockin'. This sounds like the kind of cheesy dad rock that James Lynx would put on blast in his space truck while on the job. The ending, Ring on the World, by Heart of Air is pure zen in musical form. Having two versions for each half of the show, this song is immediately relaxing, almost like a lullaby. The song is also synced to the display in Dolores, giving the ending another nice detail to calm you down after a wild episode. Dolores I was licensed by ADV in 2005, along with a decent dub, but again this release is long out of print. The Blu-ray, as always, only got released in Japan. It's frustrating to suggest Dolores to fans of the games, as it's not easily accessible anymore, and this really is a great show. The wild adventures of James Lynx are unforgettable and definitely stand out as the most fresh feeling and well-written entry in the series. It's a journey that's certainly worth taking over its 26 episodes, and it's a series I honestly think about often. It bums me out that so many fans of the game series seem to only acknowledge the Idolo OVA, as Dolores is an unforgettable trip that's certainly worth the time investment. While Dolores I wrapped up on September 29th, 2001, completing its 26-episode run, another Zone of the Enders game released 2 days earlier on September 27th. The true odd man out of the entire series, an entry unlike any other, both to its benefit and its detriment. Zone of the Enders, The Fist of Mars. Or as it was titled in Japan, 2173 Testament, would launch globally as an exclusive for the Game Boy Advance. Fist of Mars is an interesting title for many reasons. For one, the game was developed by former Super Robot Wars dev Winkysoft, immediately giving it a decent foot to start off on. But the game also had very little direct Konami involvement, and was primarily the work of Winkysoft through and through. And even then, looking at the staff behind the title, many of the names attached had this as the first mecha game they had ever worked on at the studio. Noriake Okamura would serve as producer for the game, giving it at least one major tie to the rest of the Zone of the Enders franchise. But his input on the overall flow of the project was fairly limited. This game's development was a strange case of an almost entirely new staff being commissioned to create a spin-off with little connection to the rest of the series, as well as being part of a vastly different genre, and being built for a handheld that was nowhere near as powerful as the consoles of the time. Fist of Mars is a strategy RPG, which makes it very far removed from the action game that Zone of the Enders was. To make things even more wild with this entry, its story was written by Naoya Inui, who would later move on to write the divisive Fire Emblem Fates, and Kazuyushi Horikawa, who would only ever write for one game after this, 2018's Shining Resonance Refrain. The story these two put together for this title happens to be its biggest strength and its biggest handicap. Set in 2173, a year after the events of the first game and Dolores, The story of Fist of Mars follows Cage Midwell, a teenage boy from Earth, traveling aboard the ship the Bonaparte III, when it's suddenly attacked by a mysterious military force. Separated from his best friend and personal idol, Ares, he manages to escape the ship along with an amnesiac girl named Mayona Olderan, thanks to boarding a strangely powerful Lev unit that turns out to be the orbital frame Testament in disguise. The frame is equipped with the battle AI Fairsty, who serves a similar role to Ada from the original game. After making it safely to the surface of Mars, Cage and Mayona are recruited by Dexon Gaze, the leader of a space colony-based rebel group called BIS. A group that's set on freeing Mars and the colonies from Earth's control in a pacifist manner that runs counter to Barom's MO. With Ares soon reuniting with Cage and joining up with BIS, the group sets out on their path to stop the endless conflict between Barom and the UNSF. The plot of Fist of Mars has one major leg up on the other two games in the series, that also ends up being the cause of its slip-up. Those aspects are its length, as well as its hard focus on its central theme. Fist of Mars is a game about the brutal relationship between colonies and the colonial powers that control them, with this story focusing on the conflict between the Mars colonies and Earth. The game tackles the topics of independence, self-sufficiency, government overreach, and the bloody trail that revolution leads to. And from a thematic perspective, this makes Fist of Mars unquestionably the most mature entry in the entire series. The other titles and anime certainly focus on these themes, but at more of a surface level. Fist of Mars, on the other hand, makes an attempt at actually exploring these topics with some nuance. I say an attempt, because the storytelling here isn't particularly strong. The narrative structure of the game is painfully predictable, in a manner that actively detracts from the subjects it's attempting to tackle, and the root of this issue really comes from BIS itself and how the story unfolds. A majority of BIS only pilots basic ground vehicles and heavily modified LEVs. This removes the group's sense of borderline invincibility that the power of a single runner in an orbital frame provides. If BIS's select few frame runners were unable to perform up to snuff, it could put any other member of the group at risk. As the conflict marches on, and a conspiracy involving the UNSF attempting to create their own orbital frames unravels, Cage is forced to throw himself head-on into a conflict he was never a part of, finding his place among his allies and proving himself as a worthy member of BIS. Fist of Mars is structured like a 25-episode anime, with each primary scenario taking anywhere from 7 to 30 minutes. Each of these scenarios essentially serves as one episode of the game. The title being an SRPG makes for long, uninterrupted segments of text, giving ample time to develop each character in the game from the members of BIS to Barom to the UNSF. And for the most part, this cast of characters is pretty decent. Cage's journey of discovering his own self-worth is well handled, and his fluctuating mood and mindset do a solid job of putting you in the shoes of this 17-year-old. He's at the cusp of where the world would consider him an adult, but emotionally he's not quite there yet. His personal journey is quite similar to Leo's in that sense, though Cage is given far more time to actually grow into a mature freedom fighter. He's essentially a more fleshed out, slightly more aggressive version of Leo. Unfortunately, a shortcoming in his development is Fairsty, who ends up being particularly uninteresting compared to Ada. Fairsty very much feels like the exact same ground being retread, just without a decent vocal performance to lend her disconnected AI tone. Her dialogue often reads as uneven, with what feels like constant mood swings that don't communicate her development well. The major plot twist involving her is also painfully predictable. In fact, nearly every plot twist in Fist of Mars is so easy to telegraph that if you've consumed any work of serialized fiction, you'll know exactly where the story is going beat for beat. While it stays true to its central themes, which is always a good baseline in storytelling, everything about the presentation of Fist of Mars narrative, aside from some strong character writing, is drier than a raisin. Which again is immensely disappointing when looking at the game's attempt at diving deeper into the series' central themes. Every character in the game fills a specific archetype. The three characters I enjoy the most, the hot-headed sniper Razma, the peppy but easily flustered explosives expert Samil, and the cocky rich kid turned rebel Yukito, all fit into their respective archetypes, with very little to actually help them stand out despite being my three favorites in the cast. Dexon is a withered old veteran with a heart of gold, who's dead set on leading his crew to victory. Mebius is the kind-hearted group mom with a tragic past. Warren is the calm and collected stoic fighter, barely saying a word but always coming in clutch. And Phil is the energetic young man who secretly harbors immense guilt. All of these character archetypes are classic for a teen-focused story, and on paper it's a great way to build a cast of easily definable characters. But again, the problem is that, aside from some later sequences involving Phil, little is done to shake the mold at all, or give any sense of identity to the script. Generic isn't a bad thing. A predictable and plain but well-told story is still a good, engaging story. But when out of every entry in the series, this one consists of easily the most dialogue and the most complex themes, it hurts to have otherwise decent characters hampered by flat writing. Many of the side characters who get recruited for the game also get very little dialogue, making them feel borderline non-existent for a good chunk of the title despite being usable units. The villains, aside from one exceptionally funny little shithead introduced late into the game, also don't have much going for them, beyond introducing some broader lore implications to the Zone of the Enders universe. The game ends up feeling so dry that it practically does nothing for its central themes, despite them being very clearly presented throughout every conversation in the title. I ended up being far more invested in Leo's journey of growth in the face of war, despite how standard the original game's narrative was. At least in that title, its short length led to a quick but satisfying central arc that pulled some classic Kojima Productions commentary on war's effects on the innocent. Whereas Fist of Mars, despite taking a long-winded and more mature approach to its story, somewhat misses the mark by having none of the dialogue actually be engaging to read. Except for Amante, she's hilarious. But Fist of Mars does have one trick up its sleeve to try and counteract this sense of simplicity, and that's by having branching routes. It has two playable story routes. The primary 25 scenario Route A, which the game makes unbelievably easy to blitz through, and the 24 scenario Route B, that actively requires you to intentionally play certain scenarios as terribly as you possibly can to access. During scenario 12 of the game, 3 bounty hunters who go by the name the Mars Angels show up and challenge Cage, to see if he can destroy more unmanned drones than they can. After these ladies issue this challenge to Cage, killing more drones than the Angels grants you Route A, while the Angels killing more drones locks you to Route B. This is due to the winner of this challenge receiving a piece of vital information that exposes dangerous secrets involving the truth of the Bonaparte 3's destruction. Sadly, while some major plot beats are different between these two routes, the changes mainly come down to the fate of Ares and Phil. Having a split route is very welcome, and at least gives the game a bit more room to stretch its legs. But its application, as well as the minimal impact it ends up having on the actual final battle and outcome of the story, makes it come across as very half-baked. And to go into more detail as to why, I have to discuss the gameplay of the title. If the narrative falls short of its potential, then the gameplay is unfortunately a massive slog. The title plays as a no-frills SRPG. Move units around the map, destroy enemy units, get your units to the marked objective section of the map, use support units to heal and resupply your crew. As units level up, their base stats increase, and credits are earned to buy more ability and weapon upgrades. Stats for each unit's playstyle can be adjusted slightly in between scenarios if need be. Rinse and repeat for all 24 to 25 missions. While this sounds like fine old standard fare SRPG gameplay, some of the gimmicks unique to this game that Winkysoft employed to make it stand out actually end up being its biggest shortcoming. The game features a real-time dodging and attack system called IAS, the Interactive Action System. IAS works by throwing you into a targeting minigame. When your unit is attacking, landing a single pixel of an enemy unit in your crosshairs will cause a hit to land, with the reticle being fully centered over the unit leading to a critical. When an enemy attacks, IAS will reverse this minigame, having your crosshairs move around to avoid an enemy attack. Now as a concept, this is a cool way of making each attack different and more interactive and skill-based. Now it sure would suck if the IAS system was the most lopsided in-your-favor attack system in any video game. Battles are so unfathomably rigged in your favor that even if you don't purchase any weapon upgrades at all, the natural leveling process for each unit, plus how easy it is to cheese IAS, means that battles will just have you steamrolling the opposition. There's no difficulty setting either, so this game is just one big series of mindless inputs. IAS can be toggled off, much like attack animations. Animations which look quite stiff, by the way. And this will cause attacks on both fronts to be based on your hit percentage rate. While this does significantly speed up the pace of each map, it's silly to not just keep IAS on, and take little to no damage. Adding on top of that are data centers placed throughout certain maps that Cage can enter. These data centers weaken the enemies still on the map even further, and this is why the route split feels like such an oddity. I had 2 save files at scenario 12, one for Route A, which is incredibly easy to get, and one for Route B. I had to reload my Route B attempt 5 times before the Mars Angels AI had finally gotten a chance to get a single drone kill over me. And after this mission, the Mars Angels are only ever name dropped again once. It's an obnoxious and nearly pointless feeling requirement to access the game's alternative second half. Beyond the gameplay being somewhat sleep-inducing with its basic but at times solid story carrying all the weight, I have to say that Koji Kurasumi's mechanical design work is decent, with the little of it you can actually make out. While many of the enemy designs are just Shinkawa's work on the PS2 games recycled as sprites, the naming convention for the mechs in Fist of Mars are based around weapons and characters from cultures outside of Egypt. And while this completely breaks the orbital frame naming convention established in the rest of the series, it makes room for some nice designs, and it complements the game's place as a side story. Testament, fittingly, is an orbital frame with the silhouette of a cross, giving it a unique shape all its own that helps give it its own identity. It's also the first orbital frame in the series to feature a humanoid face. Testament is one of the 2 frames in the game to actually get proper full CG renders, really showing off its full design. And these renders are extremely compressed in the game itself, as this joint was on the GBA. But the full res renders are available separately. The mysterious black and red orbital frame that attacks the Bonaparte at the start of the game also gets a frontal render. And it does look quite cool, with wings that remind me quite a bit of Zeta Gundam's shield. Character sprites and key CG art was illustrated by Katsuo Harada, who did a really good job designing every character. giving each a varied set of expressions as well as appearances that immediately capture the feeling of their respective archetype. A part of good character design is being able to tell a lot about a character just by giving them a look, and Hirata took that philosophy to heart while designing the cast. At this point, I would usually discuss the quality of the music, but I think I'll just let the main menu track of the game explain everything. The only track that really stands out is the loadout song in between scenarios. Aside from that, the soundtrack in the game is fairly barren and pretty weak. Fist of Mars was only ever released on the Game Boy Advanced, never receiving a port or collection re-release of any kind. This is a bit of a shame, because while the game is certainly the most plain thing to come out of Zone of the Enders, it still has its moments. Its gameplay is a drag, and its story is good but predictable, and it may not actually contribute as much to the Zone of the Enders universe as it would have wanted to, but it provides a few decent winks and nods in its final act that do solidify its place in Zone of the Enders canon, despite it being what I'd rank as the lowest entry in the franchise. If you enjoyed the expansion of Zone of the Enders world in Idolo and Dolores, then it's at least worth a single playthrough through Route A, just to get a little more out of the Zone of the Enders universe. It's definitely the most forgettable entry in the series though, that's for sure.
Good morning. Ready for combat? This is Detached Backup Battle Unit, Ada. Do you request control instructions?
But in the last half year, the situation on Mars has changed drastically. Now, Balram's war potential is very strong. The Space Force put up a stubborn resistance, but without a major war, Mars was occupied by Balram in a flash. Almon is already getting ready. Only those two machines can make Almon move or stop.
With the strong sales of the first game, and the continued interest over 2001 thanks to the spin-off titles, a second mainline PS2 game was inevitable. Kojima would move forth and assemble a new development team, with him and Okamura coming up with a basic outline for what the story of the game would be. Zone of the Enders, Anubis, as it was titled in Japan, or Zone of the Enders, the second runner as it was titled globally, would be moved into production. After these initial concepts were set, Kojima would approach Shuyo Murata, asking him to move up far from his role as a CG director of the first game, and letting him take on the intense full reins of lead game designer, lead writer, and director. In the game industry, it's not too uncommon for a young up-and-coming member of a studio to be moved from a secondary production role to a role of much larger influence on a sequel. But for Kojima to trust Murata with basically being the voice of the game, and not Okamura who oversaw the first title, he was putting immense faith in the young director. In the book, Visual Works of Anubis, which chronicled the development process of the second runner, a tell-all interview that was translated by shmupulations.com has Kojima explain his trust in Murata by stating, "I appointed Murata as director for Anubis, because we had shared some same ingredients. He had worked on the Metal Gear Solid team with me, and he had been a part of the motion and effects sub-teams. But the thing is, if you change the chef, then you're going to get a different dish. It doesn't make sense to put a chef in charge and then deny him the ability to add his own individual flavor. And I wanted Murata to be able to freely build his world, which would then draw in a whole new fan demographic that is specific to him." The second runner from the get-go was planned to not just be an iteration of the first game, but a full overhaul that addressed every single key criticism that the first title received, while bringing the core concepts established in that title and the expanded Zone of the Enders universe to new heights. The game that Murata and his team would create would turn out to be not just one of, if not the best mecha action games, but one of the best games on the PlayStation 2, and arguably one of the greatest of all time. The second runner follows the story of Dingo Egret in 2174. 2 years after the events of the first game, a former frame runner from Barum, who was renowned for his unmatched skills in the cockpit, who cut himself off from the terrorist group to hide away as a Metatron miner on the Callisto moon of Jupiter. While on a regularly scheduled exhibition, Dingo finds himself face to face with none other than Jehudi, now hidden beneath the surface of Callisto. Just as he finds himself beside the mech, Barum launches an attack on the miners, forcing Dingo to enter the cockpit of an orbital frame once again, waking Jehudi and Ada from a 2-year slumber. After crossing paths with the Barum runner Ken Marinaris and her frame Arjet, Dingo finds himself face to face with the current leader of Barum and his former boss, Nomen, who pilots the ultimate orbital frame, Anubis. And after a certified ass beating brought on by Nomen, he shoots Dingo in the heart, nearly killing him. From here, Dingo is modified in secret by Ken, as he's thrown back into the cockpit of Jehudi, now essentially a walking corpse whose life is dependent on Jehudi's energy to power his new artificial heart. Dingo's hand is forced, as he sets out to stop Nomen from activating the super weapon Almon, a device so destructive that the very continued existence of Earth and Mars is put at risk. Zone of the Enders 2 is a roller coaster with little to no downtime. The game throws you and Dingo through a collection of non-stop back-to-back set pieces of increasingly intense scale, taking a more linear focus to the game's design. The second runner has no overworld map or backtracking. It's a straight shot through one linear, airtight campaign that clocks in at around an hour longer than the original game. While the push for a more linear design can often end up being the detriment to many games, Zone of the Enders 2 pulls through by sticking to a tried and true method of dashing from engaging set piece to engaging set piece, all intercut with some of my favorite boss battles of the 6th console generation. Zone of the Enders 2 uses the same base gameplay as the original Zone of the Enders, right down to an identical control scheme. It differentiates itself from the first game by making fantastic adjustments and rebalancing the systems, leading to a game that moves at least 20% faster than the original title, while also feeling overall tighter to control. The combat is still based around that full 360 space movement, with still, dash, and charge-based attacks. But to accommodate for the increased speed, the lock-on in Zone of the Enders 2 has been vastly improved, always keeping Jehudi centered, and moving the camera around it accordingly. Swapping between targets is also blisteringly fast, and Jehudi's projectiles have been given a new mode of attack. By holding the attack button while at a distance, Jehudi will auto-target large groups of enemies, shooting out a powerful screen-filling circus of beams to do some serious damage. The boost has also been sped up quite a bit, letting Jehudi burst in and out of an enemy's radius for combos that feel immensely satisfying to land. Jehudi's basic throw is also replaced by a sick grab and toss that can be extended into a spin by holding the grab input, increasing the velocity of the throw and letting you use enemy bodies against each other. Tossing one raptor into another and watching both of them explode never gets old, and the speed of the game just further encourages you to go all out. Sub-weapons have also seen a major step up. All the sub-weapons from the original game return and feel far more satisfying to use, some functioning in new ways entirely that better incentivize actually using them in combat. On top of that, the brand new sub-weapons such as the almighty Vector Cannon, the incredibly powerful heat-seeking missiles, the long-distance enemy pull Wisp, and the late-game Zero Shift make for an even wider variety of tools to apply at any given time. The Vector Cannon, despite being sold as a set-piece weapon, only actually getting 2 major uses in the game due to its slow but incredibly cool charge-up, can still be used by clever players as a screen-clearing menace if timed correctly. Usage of these sub-weapons is also no longer based on specific types of ammo for each. All of them share a universal sub-weapon meter that gets frequently refilled by Metatron cubes earned throughout the map and from fights. To make Jehudi's kit even more complete, you can now grab steel rods and armor plates from parts of the environment to use as melee weapons, shields, and projectiles. Meaning if you're out of sub-weapon meter, there are still tools to help you keep your distance while dealing big damage. And with an improved enemy radar that's always standing out around Jehudi, making it far easier to follow the massive groups of enemies the game throws at you, you'll never get lost or disoriented. The game's combat is hypnotic and addictive. Once you're in the flow, it's impossible to break out. This is one of those games that you can sit down and run through over and over again thanks to just how strong its set pieces and combat are. But thankfully, the game isn't a cakewalk either. While Zone of the Enders 1 certainly had its harder moments, the second runner's increased speed applies to enemies too, who also have increased numbers per fight, as well as some new foes that fit this sped up playstyle. These groups can and will bust you up pretty badly at times, always attempting to overwhelm you and dealing a very fair but punishing amount of damage per hit. Sometimes enemy groups in Zone of the Enders 2 rival a Musa title in size, causing things to get quite hectic but very fun to partake in. Boss fights are no longer giant machines that force you into a basic pattern of attack. Every boss in Zone of the Enders 2 is built around the improved combat system, with the majority of the fights being one-on-one battles against equally fast and powerful frames, who you can deal some serious damage to all at once if you have a good grasp of the game's combat. Even the boss fights that are closest in design to the original game are still built more around the immense speed and precision of the second runner. The improved gameplay also cleverly finds a way to tie into the story of the game. While Leo in the first title was a child thrown into the cockpit of Jehudi, Dingo is a very experienced runner. This is still the same Jehudi from the original game, just now placed in the hands of someone with far more skill, both in the sense of the returning player and Dingo. Everything in the second runner just comes together to make for one of the most mechanically satisfying mecha games ever made. Murata's choice to refocus the game on a string of interconnected set pieces made for an experience with far sharper pacing than the original game's fairly abrupt shifts between story segments. That said, not every segment in the game lands. The 2 lowest points of the game both involve a removal of a number of aspects of the usual gameplay. A minefield segment later into the game, despite having one preset route to follow every time, is still an unfortunate slog that serves as a weak buffer in between 2 far more engaging levels. Escorting a busted orbital frame up a burning tower also isn't exactly a fun time. Thankfully, for me at least, these 2 segments serve as the game's only low points, and a fantastic central gameplay loop is only one of the second runner's strengths. Its art direction and visuals are spectacular. Murata instructed his team to take Okamura and Kojima's idea of Zone of the Enders being a playable anime to its natural extreme by readjusting the art style with a subtle use of cell shading on the 3D models to create for a more animation-like look. Along with this, the second runner made larger use of 2D hand-drawn materials for certain assets in the game, giving everything a more textured and finely tuned look than the first title. The game's particle and attack effects were also primarily crafted in a manner that emulated old cell animation lighting techniques. In older cell-animated series, many instances of exceptionally bright lights were done through a technique called cell underlighting, which is essentially shining a light through small cuts within a cell. To emulate this look, the lighting on many of Jehudi's attacks, in particular its multi-target beam attack, were painstakingly crafted to shine in a manner that looked as if light was cutting through the image. Murata referred his team to Space Battleship Yamato and Genma Tyson for very noticeable usages of this technique. Yoji Shinkawa returned as art director and refined his designs a bit to fit in with the more adjusted anime-like art style. To complement these changes, Jehudi's color palette was slightly adjusted, with its orange highlights from the first game being toned down, and more thick, concrete line work integrated into the model to give the mech an even more 2D appearance. This time around, to avoid the rough contrast between the awkward CG cutscenes the first game created, Konami brought Studio Gonzo on board to create fully animated 2D sequences to cover any cutscenes involving characters. This gave the game a far less uncanny look than what the first game had, when transitioning between cutscenes, and made the entire game really stand out more as a playable anime. Gonzo's assets would also be used to create this game's codec calls, which are all mini 2D interactive panels. Tsubasa Masao would serve as the character designer this time around, bringing in detailed, more mature looking character designs that better fit the more extravagant look of the second game. Back to Shinkawa, his other designs outside of Jehudi for the game are equally strong. Ken's frame Arjet, based on the Egyptian winged cobra goddess Wajet, implemented a similar approach of integrating aspects of the deity into its design, though in Arjet's case, the influence is less directly obvious outside of its large regal wings and sharp human-like face, though elements of a more snake-shaped design appear when it enters its cocoon-shaped defense form. Nomen's frame Anubis is the design most directly based off of the god it's named after. With Anubis being one of the most well-known Egyptian deities around the globe, Shinkawa decided to directly take the god's common appearance and mechify it, leading to an imposing brown and yellow metallic dog, rocking a powerful staff and large cape-like funnels to serve as its wings. This design is spectacular, rivaling Jehudi in its presence and memorability. And while Anubis has the least visual elements of its own separate from the original god, it still stands out as one of Shinkawa's finest designs. The second runner's cast of characters are also far more distinct than that of the first game, and part of this was achieved by bringing on guest artists. One of the boss characters, the mad scientist Lloyd, and his frame Inert were designed by legendary Shin Megami Tensei artist Kazuma Kaneko. Lloyd is a quintessential Kaneko design. Looking at him next to the rest of the cast makes it very apparent that he's got Atlas DNA all over him. Him and his mech Inert stand out as even more of an anomaly against Masao and Shinkawa's designs. When asked to design Lloyd, Kaneko was inspired by the old mecha trope of a mad scientist who builds his catastrophic machine in secret. He extended this idea to his approach to Inert, creating a twisted, very human yet angelic design that's all black and gold in color. The direction he took with Inert was based on many special rival mecha from classic manga he grew up reading, in particular the work of Mitsuteru Yokoyama in Black Ox from Tetsujin 28 and GR2 from Giant Robo. These two very distinct designs help this character remain a unique and memorable part of the game, but to be honest, the game's entire cast is awesome. Dingo Egret is a strong contrast to Leo, a former soldier who after losing his entire squad shut himself off from the world and sought a simple life as a miner. While he's initially reluctant to fight against his hated former boss, being outright hostile to Ken and anyone else who insists that this fight is his as well, but as the game progresses, this facade cracks and it becomes clear that Dingo is very much a man of the people, valuing the lives of his allies more than anyone else. He believes deeply in Mars' independence still, and despite going his separate ways from Baram, he would still gladly fight to see the colony he was born and raised on freed from Earth's clutches. That said, he's still got a very welcome layer of snark and general foolishness that really makes him at home as a PS2 action game protagonist. You know, the era where 90% of action game heroes were jackasses with hearts of gold. That's really what Dingo is, and he's a solid contrast to the nervous child Leo was in the first game. Speaking of Leo, he returns as well, now 15 years old and piloting a transforming mech version of Vic Viper from Konami's Gradius series. Leo hasn't changed all too much from where the ending of Zone of the Enders 1 left him, but he has a general sense of confidence and more trust in himself this time around. He desperately wants to save Ada and Jehudi, and boils with frustration and arguably jealousy at the fact that she's rocking with Dingo now. This is basically a story about Mecha and TR. Shit would almost be tragic if Dingo weren't so entertaining. Ken Marinaris is the driving force of the game's plot, actively working against Baram as a sleeper agent, maneuvering in clever ways around the organization to make sure Dingo gets ready to defeat the evil Nomen. Her and Dingo end up developing a solid back and forth dynamic, bouncing off of each other in a way that makes their eventual friendship feel pretty well earned. Nomen is a riot, When it comes to over-the-top villains who just chew the scenery, he's gotta be one of the best from the PS2 era. Just cartoonishly evil, oozing with cheese every line. He feels like a sort of greatest hits amalgamation of 70s children's mecha antagonists. Nomen is absurdly evil. Seeing this cartoon villain as the commander of Bahram, an organization he's slowly been manipulating entirely into his control since the events of the first game, is very satisfying after his small appearances throughout the series. He does not disappoint after this much build-up. The game's side characters, while they don't have much screen time, are also quite fun. One element exclusive to the English version of the game that has to be addressed though, is the frankly baffling but immensely entertaining English dub. I'm serious when I say that this dub is one of the biggest anomalies in the history of English localization. For all intents and purposes, it's terrible. But there's something so hypnotic about this game's dub. The English script itself is rather stiff in how it's written, but that's not the biggest issue for a game that's plot is more focused on providing a thrill ride, while only dipping its toes into some of its deeper themes. But the acting is honestly some of the funniest I've ever heard, to a point where dialogue from this game plays in my head daily. From stiff acting with lines read far too quickly to try and match a character's mouth movements.
You can't deceive me with beautiful words like freedom and independence anymore! Do you realize how many of my comrades died back there? Say it. You killed them!
Weird ass unexplainable noises.
Get lost.
And other oddities in the pace of how conversations are edited. I can recite a good amount of the English version script by heart. And that's not getting started on how the English script practically has its own language. A pal is a close friend who's still alive. A comrade is a close friend who's passed away. And a buddy is the most intimate status a human being can have. Peter Bartow provides the voice for Dingo, and he puts on one of the most hilarious performances of the 6th gen. Both sounding completely bored and flat at all times, while somehow also exhibiting too much personality. In an odd turn of events, he ended up nailing the role, and making Dingo an even more memorable protagonist. Remy LeBouf and Cynthia Marcucci reprise their roles as Leo and Ada respectively. There's not much to add onto Marcucci's work as Ada here. She puts in a near identical performance to her work in the first game. LeBouf had clearly entered puberty since recording the first game's audio, giving a surprising sense of realism to the now 15-year-old Leo. I love getting to hear a voice actor correctly age alongside a character they play, and despite still putting on an overall stiff performance, he definitely walked into the second game with a stronger sense of confidence, and that can be heard in his delivery. Renee Hewitt plays Ken Marinaris, in a performance that comes pretty close to matching the rigid yet surprisingly fitting delivery of Bartow's work as Dingo. She certainly makes some of the most comical noises I've heard a game character make. The real standout performance in the game though has to be Roger Jackson as Nomen. Best known for doing the over-the-phone voice of Ghostface in the Scream series. And oh yeah, Mojo Jojo. Nomen is without question Jackson's funniest role to date, and it's entirely intentional on his part. On the other side of the audio front, the sound design in Second Runner is fantastic. Reusing much of Metal Gear Solid 2's sound library, as well as the same sound fonts for most of its music, the audio provides a good sense of how lightweight yet powerful Jehudi is, with pulsating electronic music complementing the game's speed. The soundtrack was composed by that same Konami power group as the first title, but unfortunately, Heart of Air did not make a return to handle any music in this follow-up. Maki Kimura of the game's music team would compose and perform its central vocal theme, Beyond the Bounds. Beyond the Bounds is a very good track. That's a part of the series that's remembered just as fondly as the game it came from. But I'd be lying if I said I preferred it over Kiss Me Sunlights. That said, much like the rest of the game, it's a pretty unforgettable track. On top of a solid, more focused set-piece-based main story, Zone of the Enders 2 also brought on a ton of side content. From a cool 1v1 multiplayer mode, where you hop into battle as any of the mechs in the game, to a minigame that parodies Gradius, to unlockable difficulties, and a very intuitive New Game Plus system, allowing you to select any specific version of Jehudi from throughout the story, and over 100 score-based side missions to collect that really test your skills as a runner. Zone of the Enders 2 is packed. Despite a short but very satisfying single-player campaign, this side content makes the game feel genuinely content-rich. And that's not even discussing the secret missions found by clicking L3 and R3, or the signature Kojima Productions Easter eggs you can find too. The Second Runner is incredible, and the critical and audience reception of the game at the time and now reflects that. The game received almost universal praise, though unfortunately it didn't sell quite as well as the first game, this being a likely result of not having a Metal Gear Solid demo packed in with it. But it did well enough where Konami still considered the title a success. So with all of that said, for people who have never played the game before, I'm gonna give a quick rundown of all the versions of the game, to point old and new players in the right direction for what the best version is. The original PS2 release is pretty great, and of course it is. The game was designed around this hardware. Unfortunately, during some of the bigger, more intense set pieces, as the screen fills with environmental and particle effects, this game can chug. Some sequences hitting as low as 15 frames per second. The performance is passable otherwise, managing to hit 60 frames per second during some of the lighter sequences. So the PS2 version is definitely a good, but not the best choice. Much like the first game, when the Zone of the Enders HD collection released in 2012, in its initial state, The second runner was a mess, performing far worse than the PS2 version at its lowest points, and missing half of the environment and particle effects that made the game such a visual treat in the first place. This version was bad, but there is an important caveat. On the PS3 version of the HD collection, the second runner received a performance patch that restored many of the missing visual effects and brought the game to a reasonably steady 60 frames per second. This is, in my opinion, the second best way to play the game. The PS3 port of the HD collection patched. Zone of the Enders 1 is still messy here, but the second runner once patched on the PS3 is a really good way to experience the game. As for the Xbox version of the HD collection, well, much like the first game, you will get 60 FPS if you play on an Xbox Series S or X console, through backwards compatibility. But the visual effects that were initially missing are still missing on this version, so it's not ideal to play this way if you can avoid it. Finally, in 2018, out of nowhere, Cygames and Konami announced a collaboration to remaster the second runner, as Zone of the Enders Mars, the second runner, released for the PS4 and PC. In my opinion, this is the definitive version of Zone of the Enders 2. Cygames went through a painstaking amount of work to recreate and redraw every single asset in the game, adding harsh new lighting and certain set pieces that makes them even more atmospheric than they originally were, and going through an insane amount of effort to make sure every design is kept true to its PS2 original, while leaning closer to Shinkawa's original sketches, by emphasizing much thicker, more textured line work that, despite using the same polygon counts, makes the models look far more detailed. Cygames knocked this remaster out of the park. When I think about what the ideal remaster of a PS2 game is, it's this. Cygames product manager Kondo Konichi impressed Okamura so much that any fears he had of the Mars remaster being screwed up were completely erased once he saw what Cygames had done. And while some designs have minor details added, nothing is changed in a way that takes away from the original designs. Shinkawa's original designs and Konami's original models are very well respected here. On top of this, Cygames didn't stop there. An explorable hangar bay was added. Once fully explored, you unlock a ton of original concept art from the second runner. They also added a 3D model viewer, allowing you to view every single model in the game, in its original PS2 model, and Cygames' own touched-up models, letting you switch on the fly. This is great. This is the content I love to see in a remaster. Cygames even added an alternate button layout, an alternate appearance for the sub-weapon menu, bonus animations during the Gradius minigame, and a brand new difficulty mode. And then there's the addition to this version that was used to market it. In an effort to push the PS4's new VR headset, and the recent boom in VR headsets for PCs, Cygames implemented a VR mode. Do not play this game in VR. The mode is very well made, putting you directly where Dingo would be sitting, and looking down you can even see Dingo's lap right there. The problem is, in a game this fast, even with the very tight lock-on of the original game, you're definitely going to experience some nausea playing it like this. I have pretty high VR tolerance, and this game still pushed it. I understand why they added this little feature, and I think it's worth trying out if you have a VR headset for your PS4 or PC. I cannot recommend playing the game in this mode as your first time through. Please stick to the original camera and perspective, because this mode is very much a neat, albeit headache-inducing side feature. But with all of that said, I still believe that Cygames' remastered Mars edition of the game is the definitive way to play the second runner. It's available on PS4 and PC, but despite being a fantastic remaster and the best version of the second runner, it sold pretty poorly, only pushing around 100,000 copies in its lifetime. And while this is definitely a bummer, I'm happy this remaster happened at all, if only because it gives people an easier way of playing one of the greatest games to ever release for the PS2. After the development of the second runner, much of its staff would move on to assist in the development of Metal Gear Solid 3: Snake Eater. And for some time, the fate of Zone of the Enders was unknown, though Kojima stated that he certainly had interest in developing a third game. Though after the release of MGS3 in 2004, and its updated re-release in 2005, Subsistence, Kojima Productions would pretty much shift all of their focus into developing MGS4, a title that at the time was intended to be the final entry in the Metal Gear saga. Though we all know that didn't come to fruition, cause Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker moved into development pretty much immediately after, and any possibility of Zone of the Enders 3 seemed very slim, though that all changed in May of 2012. During a special announcement night for the Zone of the Enders HD collection, Kojima ended the presentation with the reveal that Zone of the Enders 3 was in development, in the studio's brand new Fox engine. All that was shown off was a screenshot of a new Jehudi model, one that looked far more gangly and organic than the original mech, with a physical statue of this new Jehudi brought along to show off a full view of this new detailed design, as well as showing off a new Shinkawa illustration of a young woman who is likely to be the game's protagonist. While not entirely confirmed, it was stated by those who attended the event that Zone of the Enders 3 would actually be set in an ancient civilization, detailing the origins of Metatron and the potential beginnings of the technology the Zone of of the Enders world was built around. Zone of the Enders 3 would go under the working name Enders Project, with Kojima and team hoping to move the game further into production later that year. Unfortunately, after the Zone of the Enders HD collection underperformed commercially in 2012, in May of 2013, exactly a year after the announcement of the Enders Project, Kojima would announce its unfortunate cancellation, with Koji Pro shifting their whole focus into the development of Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain, and its prologue chapter, Ground Zeroes. And this was a really heartbreaking announcement, but it didn't make everybody entirely lose faith in the idea of a third Zone of the Enders game. What caused that to happen was the late 2015 ordeal between Kojima and Konami that led to the esteemed director leaving the studio, taking much of his primary staff with him, and moving on to form the contemporary Kojima Productions which developed Death Stranding. This would include second runner director Shuyo Murata, who would work as a writer on Death Stranding. So Zone of the Enders, for all intents and purposes, is kind of just sitting in Konami's vault. It's not even that the series is on life support. Again, the Mars remaster happened in 2018 in collaboration with Cygames, and Noriaki Okamura is still working at Konami, serving as a producer on many of Konami's recent re-releases. But considering the overall inactivity of the Kojima Productions IPs that Konami still owns, and the underperformance of the second runner Mars, it really does feel like this was a franchise that only existed for 2 years. 2001 to 2003. And to be quite honest, I don't need a third Zone of the Enders. To me, the second runner was a near perfect execution of what the series was pitched as. And while yes, I would love to see a current gen Zone of the Enders game, with much of its staff having departed from Konami, I don't know if I'd quite trust the development of a new one. Even if Cygames showed immense love for the second runner in their Mars remaster, and even stated that they had interest in giving the first Zone of the Enders a similar remaster treatment, and while much of Cygames clearly loves Zone of the Enders deeply, an entirely new title developed by them is something I would be cautiously optimistic about. Yes, a third mainline Zone of the Enders would definitely be exciting, but to me the franchise really represents the era it came out in. It came out at a time when weird multimedia projects were all the buzz. Nowadays you couldn't produce a series like Zone of the Enders. Between the anime tie-ins, the Game Boy spinoff, and the original game all releasing in the same year, only to be followed up by an excellent sequel 2 years later, it really was a product of the creative freedom of the 6th gen. And frankly, I'm okay with Zone of the Enders being over, as long as its memory isn't forgotten, and it's remembered for its incredibly unique and extremely fun gameplay, and its broad celebration for the mecha genre overall. Zone of the Enders was special. It was more than just Kojima Productions' secondary series. It's something that represents a long-gone era in video games and anime, an expertly executed multimedia venture, and one that I believe we should still cherish to this day.
Mission completed. I can say nothing but spectacular.
Yeah, I know. Call me a genius runner.
Genius runner.
Don't take it seriously.